We Kiwis love to travel. In the last year alone, we took more than 2 million overseas trips. But when you or your family next head out of the country, you might want to consider this. If you or they should get in trouble with the law while travelling, having one of these could be a distinct disadvantage. That's because New Zealand is now the only country in the OECD that is yet to sign up to what are called international prisoner transfers, which let people imprisoned in countries they're not from travel back to their home country to serve out their sentence. In other words, if a Kiwi winds up in a prison overseas because of, say, a fatal car crash, a drunken brawl, or if they're caught with drugs, unlike most Westerners in the same predicament, they cannot apply to serve out their sentence in a prison back home. It's a fact these outgoing Kiwi travellers were unaware of and a little unsettled by too.
I would rather do my sentence in my own country than somewhere else. Well, I have several grandchildren now travelling overseas, and I'd like to think if anything happened that they would be able to come home.
You'd like to serve it at home where your family can see you?
We should be able to come home and serve our time regardless of what we've done.
They should do something about it.
But it's something our leaders are well aware of and have been for a number of decades. The oldest international prisoner transfer treaty was signed by 5 Scandinavian countries 50 years ago. And 30 years ago, the Council of Europe drew up this, the Convention on the Transfer of Sentenced Persons, an agreement that's since been ratified by 64 countries, including all of Europe except Belarus, Canada, the US and much of Latin America, Japan, South Korea and the Philippines, Australia and even Tonga. It makes transfers between all those countries possible with the following key conditions. For starters, the prisoner's crime must still be an offence in their homeland, and they must have at least 6 months of their sentence to serve. And while the prisoner's homeland cannot review their conviction once they're back, it can reduce their sentence to bring it into line with its own sentencing laws. There's also a similar Commonwealth scheme, a North and South American pact, and transfer treaties between the UK and 22 countries, Canada and 15, and Australia and 5, including China. So why then, when so many other countries have already signed up to international transfers, are we yet to do the same? We'll get to that soon, but first, the benefits of having them for both the prisoners and their families. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs told us that as of 2 weeks ago, it knew of 63 Kiwis who are behind bars for crimes in 20 different countries. They include Sharon Armstrong in Argentina, who's 2 years into a 4-year sentence for cocaine trafficking. She says she was set up. Graham Cleghorn in Cambodia, who's midway through a 20-year sentence for the rape of 5 teenage maids. He insists he's innocent. And a 57-year-old known only as Kim, who's awaiting trial in South Korea for allegedly spying for the North. All 3 plus 53 others are in countries with transfer agreements, including 20 in the States, 7 in China and 5 in Japan, which ratified the European Convention in 2003, the year before Masterton's Glenn McIsaac was jailed there himself for trying to smuggle 1.5 kilos of methamphetamine, or P, into that country.
I just needed a lot of money in a hurry, and that was it. And this was offered to me. I turned it down flat. 3 or 4 times I turned it down flat until the situation just got beyond my reach and my control.
McIsaac says he was promised 10 grand if he got the drugs into Japan, but instead he earned himself 7 years in their notoriously strict prison system. When did you first become aware of international prisoner transfers?
I was being processed into the prison, and they said to me, "Where am I from?" I said, "I'm from New Zealand." And they then have a list. They go down the list and they say, "Well, look, you know, your country is not a signatory to the Transfer Pact."
3 years later, he started writing to our politicians, lobbying them to adopt transfers. Not because he was being mistreated, but so he could be near to his family.
I never once felt threatened for my life. I would have much rather served my time back home because, you know, I have a young son. I missed out on watching him grow, and it's just like, home is where the heart is, you know, and that's just where you mend.
Indeed, a UN paper published last year says prisoners who do their time in their homeland are more likely to be rehabilitated and reintegrated into society. And whether or not you believe that's what prison is about, it is at least officially what our government subscribes to. A stated purpose of our correction system being the rehabilitation and reintegration of offenders in order to reduce reoffending. The UN also says the recognised effects of prison on prisoners' families, including financial problems and psychological harm, are highly likely to be exacerbated if the prisoner is abroad. In McIsaac's case, it was his mother Bev who wound up raising his son Jack.
So how hard was it for you as his mother?
Really hard. Not just the fact that he was there, but financially at this end. I had to send money through to him because I couldn't send any warm clothing. It had to be sent in money. And that was hard, with, you know, being on a pension and, you know, trying to fill in those gaps as a grandmother was just really hard. Because he was only 2 when it happened, he didn't even know what Dad looked like.
The UN also points to a strong case for transfers out of countries whose prison conditions are poor. Conditions like those endured by Auckland man Billy Cook in Panama, Central America.
You chucked in a big hall, 350 people with 150 beds and no running water. For the first year and a half, 2 years, I slept on the concrete floor. It was just damaging for my back. I still suffer the consequences of that today, which I borrowed 200 American dollars to get a bed. And then there was pressure applied to get the money back, and some of the, I witnessed a few killings, and they were quite gory sort of stabbings and one beheading.
Cook's crime was cocaine trafficking, for which he spent 6.5 years in Panama. He says he only survived thanks to money sent over by his brother and other supporters.
I've seen foreigners there that had nothing, crawling around with no food, with no clothes. It's quite horrendous, you know? So if you didn't have people that were willing to help you financially, it was going to be even worse.
He says New Zealand should be willing to assist its citizens who wind up in such situations.
I wasn't asking to come back here and be let free. I was just asking to come back and be closer to family members or English-speaking people, decent food and medical attention.
Curiously, our government does recognise the benefits of prisoner transfers. However, only those that happen within New Zealand. The Department of Corrections told the nation that in 2012 alone, it approved 224 prisoner requests for transfers, usually on compassionate grounds such as to be closer to family, and 666 transfers to help with rehabilitation and reintegration. Which raises the question, if our government allows domestic prisoner transfers, then why not international ones too? It's a question John Whitty started putting to the government back in 1994 while National Director of New Zealand Prisoners' Aid.
Well, I wrote to various ministers about it, but the impression I got from them was that they were terrified that Australia would open their prisons and transfer all these New Zealanders back to serve their sentences in New Zealand. And our prisons were already pretty overcrowded.
Indeed, the then Justice Minister Doug Graham said that at that time there were 6 times as many Kiwis in Australian prisons than vice versa, meaning transfers would cost us too much. Successive Justice Ministers have made similar noises and also suggested that transfers would be seen as soft on crime. That they could send the message to Kiwi drug traffickers that they'd quickly be brought home if caught, and that Kiwi victims of foreigners imprisoned here might not perceive the offender as being punished if we sent them home. But both McIsaac and Cook dismissed the notion that transfers would make Kiwis more likely to try trafficking drugs.
They might have financial problems. This could be a way out of their financial problems. They're not looking at repatriation or anything like that. They're not looking at the consequences.
The assertion, meanwhile, that transfers would be somehow soft on crime suggests the view that all those countries that have them, the US included, are also soft on crime. A nonsense, of course, and in fact it's our basic parole eligibility law that's one of the softest in the Western world. Parole that even foreigners imprisoned here are eligible for prior to deportation, when they'd possibly serve more time in their home country if we transferred them there at the start. Corrections told us there are currently 231 foreigners doing time in New Zealand prisons. And of the 42 countries they come from, more than half are party to transfer agreements. It's because of them that the Sensible Sentencing Trust's Garth McVicker is open to a wider public discussion about us adopting international prisoner transfers.
Victims in this country want any immigrant who's offended against them on the first plane home. So that's our position on that. Whether that means we have to enter into an agreement like this further down the track to make that happen is something I suppose it needs thrashing out. We aren't too concerned about what other countries are doing with our offenders. We are looking at our home position.
At the same time, transfers would also mean that we are more aware of criminals arriving back in the country.
Far better if they serve the last few months of their sentence in New Zealand, where they can be supervised, they can reintegrate more smoothly, parole conditions can be imposed upon them, and or release plans can be arranged, and the chance of reoffending much reduced.
As for all those Kiwi prisoners in Australia, well, the exact number is hard to pin down. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs told us it was aware of only 8, but that's just those who've asked them for help. At the other end of the scale, in last year's Australian prison census, 791 inmates said they were born here. But how long they've lived over there, or if indeed they're now Australian citizens, isn't clear. Perhaps a better indication of the number who'd come back here if we had transfers is the number of Kiwi criminals Australia already deports. Australia's Immigration Department told the nation that last year it removed 117 Kiwis who failed their character test, typically due to a prison sentence of 1 year or longer. In any respect, unlike Europe, Australia currently only allows transfers with the prisoner's consent. And John Whitty believes the majority of Kiwi prisoners over there wouldn't want to come back.
Most people who are resident New Zealanders living in Australia, they have made their homes there.
And even if they wanted to come back, the experience of Ireland shows we could limit the numbers who did. Ireland initially refused to ratify the European Convention, partly due to the numbers of its nationals in UK prisons. Like us, Ireland has a resident population of around 4.5 million, as well as a large number of native-born nationals living overseas. Like us too, many of those native-born nationals live in the neighbouring country, and more than 700 of them are currently in prisons in that neighbouring country. Because of this, when Ireland did adopt transfers in 1995, it explicitly reserved the right to limit the excess of inward over outward transfers in the light of availability of prison spaces. And this report provided to the nation by Ireland's Department of Justice appears to show that that policy has been strictly adhered to. It says in the 16 years to 2011, Ireland received 445 requests for transfers home by Irish prisoners abroad, but only 142 were actually brought home. That's just 9 per year on average, and exactly the same number of foreigners Ireland transferred out in the same period. So if Ireland can make transfers work for them, why can't we do the same? Fear of upsetting Australia, perhaps? Despite the fact it ignores our requests to let Kiwis living there access social services? Or the fear that conservative Kiwi voters would disapprove, even though one day it could happen to them?
Nobody knows what it's like until they've been through it.
Fundamentally, though, this is about New Zealand falling into line with the rest of the global community. We've long prided ourselves on being at the forefront of international justice, yet when it comes to this issue, we're so out of step.
Torben Akel with that report, and it was edited by Hitendra Patel. Justice Minister Judith Collins still with us in studio. Minister, is it something of an embarrassment that we're the only Western nation not signed up to this convention?
No. In fact, while we've got actually not 13 or 700 New Zealand citizens in Australian jails, but corrections tells me about 850, and we have 26 Australians in New Zealand jails, the cost to New Zealand in bringing these people back to serve out, in some cases, very long sentences would be billions of dollars.
But should it just be about money? Should it just be about finance?
Actually, when
Is
people
it not about
go...
human rights too?
What do you mean human rights? We're talking there, the examples we had here were of rapists and of serious drug dealers. Actually, that's a very good message that when we go to other people's countries, we should expect to be punished for those sorts of offences.
Why do we buck the trend? It's good enough for the Australians, the Americans, the French, the Germans, everybody else does it, but we don't.
I can tell you, Rachel, the Australians have asked me about this for the very reason that they would like to be able to say to their people they've got rid of 850 criminals off their books and dumped them onto New Zealand. And some of these New Zealand citizens haven't lived in New Zealand since they were babies, but they're still being deported by Australia. So my view is very clear. I don't want to say to the New Zealand taxpayer, we're going to expand out the justice system to take care of these people who have paid taxes in Australia, who have lived all their lives pretty much in Australia, who have committed their crimes in Australia, and we get to pay for it. I think that's going too far, Rachel.
Okay.